Hey guys, it's Karl. So in front of me, we probably have two of the best flagships out right now, the brand new iPhone 15 Pro Max and the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra. And I've been lucky enough to use both. When the Samsung came out a couple months ago, I used this as my daily, and I've recently switched over to the iPhone. I've also taken them on some pretty incredible trips. I went to Manchester United, to Old Trafford with the S23 Ultra, shot an entire campaign there, kicked a PK, a penalty shot with this phone, and recently have come back from Greece, was at a buddy's wedding, and have used the iPhone kind of for the past 2-ish weeks since it's been out. Both incredible devices. I'll compare them, let you know what I think and which one is kind of worth it. We'll start off first with obviously pricing. I think that's the most important thing. So with Samsung phones, this is kind of, I guess, all Android phones in general. They have an original price. So this started off at 256 gigs, $11.99. It's already $100 cheaper at $10.99. And I can guarantee you by Christmas, the holidays, this will be $200 to $300 off, and even earlier into next year, $400 off. There's always deals around Samsung phones, around Android phones. They're heavily subsidized by their carriers. The iPhone, $10.99. That's of course for the 15 Pro Max, and obviously that's US dollars. If you're up here in Canada, the exchange rate is near terrible. These are around 1,500. Obviously, depending where you live, those are all very different, but the iPhone always commands a higher price. It never really goes on sale, but on the flip side, the resale value for iPhones tends to be quite high. So take that from what you will. Next off comes to the build. Both are super premium. Both are nice and hefty. I know that the iPhone is now switched over to titanium. That's just the banding around the outside. It is still a bit of a fingerprint magnet. If you were on the fence of the color, this natural titanium is the way to go. I think most people will rock a case on it, but it does have a slight curve now around the back, and that's obviously very similar to what the S23 Ultra has. This one is a bit more rounded. Both feel super premium in the hand. If you're using them with one hand, I will say that the S23 Ultra, because it is a bit more squarish on the edges, kind of digs into my palm a bit, whereas the iPhone slightly more rounded, but you'll typically be using these with two hands as they are so large. In terms of the overall, I guess, like footprint, very similar thickness. And as you can see, the Samsung just being slightly larger, that's mostly due to the screen size. So 6.7 inches versus 6.8. Both have 120 hertz. Both are a joy to use. Both watching content is probably the best across any sort of smartphone. Both having their own benefits and quirks. The iPhone, slightly brighter. I find that the screen is a bit more natural, whereas the Samsung, it's a bit more vibrant, a bit more saturated. And I still love the small hole punch cutout for the front-facing camera, whereas the iPhone has dynamic island, which I don't think is the biggest deal breaker. In my opinion, the Samsung still holds its own, even though it's a bit older. This design we've seen for the past couple years. I mean, I guess it's the same for the iPhone. It's literally what looks better to you in terms of the display. And when you look at the performance, once again, class leading, we've got the new A17 Pro. We've shifted away from the A16 Bionic, and now this is technically a Pro chip. Probably the best silicon found inside of a smartphone right now, but it's tough. You're comparing, of course, Apple's to Androids, or iOS to Android. The Samsung being slightly older with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 platform. I know that the Gen 3 will probably launch this year or be announced this year at Snapdragon Summit in Hawaii, which I'm heading to. Honestly, for day-to-day performance, whatever you throw at both of them, whether that's a hardcore multitasking, playing games, obviously I do a ton of photo editing on Lightroom on both. Their performance is near identical, maybe the slight hiccup or lag with Android, but I will say the main performance benefits for the iPhone are to its native Apple apps. That's very similar to what you see on Mac OS if you're using like Final Cut versus say Premiere. A lot of the benefits are coming to stock Apple apps with that performance. I've seen some weird things happening online. It's not happened to my unit though. Some very weird heating issues or overheating with the 15 Pros. I know that Apple is actually coming out with its own software update to kind of tackle that. Even when I was using it in Greece, I didn't have any of those issues, thankfully, but once again, mostly using the camera app to take a lot of photos, mostly using emailing to kind of keep up with what's going on in the world. I've had none of those big issues on the S23 Ultra. And in terms of battery life, once again, just like the iPhone 14 Pro Max, because the iPhone has an always-on display, I find that that just chews through the battery life, and I typically have to charge my device probably by the end of the day because I'm a pretty heavy user. First advice is to always turn off the always on display on the iPhone. I typically never need to glance at my phone when it's face down, and I've had that off on my Samsung since I've got it. And typically that's why I lean towards the larger models. It's not for the larger footprint, but just to have that extra battery life. So that's kind of the internals, I guess, on the inside. Minor changes. Obviously coming to the iPhone, it now is charging via USB-C, so both charge via the same charging port. That's not revolutionary. iPhone is finally just catching up. I will say an extra benefit for the hardware for the S23 Ultra is having the S Pen. And I typically use this to sign a lot of documents. I find that when I'm editing actually Lightroom, I like to use this little pen to highlight the scroll wheels or the sliders on it. If you are a big S Pen user, I think that's a huge pro, and I still am kind of waiting for a smaller size Apple Pencil to come to the Pro Max models. I'd love to see something that kind of snaps on with MagSafe. I'm sure Apple is secretly developing that, but in terms of extra peripherals outside of, say, like the case lineups, there is no pen support or Apple Pen support for an iPhone just yet. And kind of last but not least, hardware-wise, is the camera system. So over on the 15 Pro Max, we still have the triple camera setup. We have the 48 megapixel main, 12 megapixel ultra-wide, 12 megapixel telephoto, and in the Pro Max models, that's 120 millimeters or a 5 times optical zoom equivalent. This is really dwarfed by the 4 cameras on the S23 Ultras, especially if you're looking at this just mainly spec-wise. So 200 megapixel main camera. You still have a 10, 10, and 12, but you have 10 times the optical zoom on this. So I find that the zoom capabilities over on the S23 Ultra are kind of unmatched, as well as 100 times digital zoom. Obviously, you won't be using that all the time, but the fact that it has that capability to zoom that far, it's quite impressive. So for the sensors, definitely the S23 Ultra takes the cake here, but that's where kind of numbers, other than say like actual optical zoom numbers, are not really misleading, but in terms of, I'd say, performance for picture quality, both are really, really good. Video wise, I will give the huge nod over to the iPhone. It takes the best smartphone video, like hands down, period. The S23 Ultra, it's gotten better, especially uploading to social. I know that the algorithm and the compression on it has really gotten better in the past couple years, but stuff, say, on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, it just gets compressed less over on iPhone. And the pictures, I think, stock look better, or I guess the photo content looks better coming out of the iPhone, whereas the Samsung, you still need to tweak it, sometimes a bit too saturated, sometimes a bit soft. It sometimes feels like the photos have a bit of a beauty mode or filter on top of them. I know that you can go into the pro settings and take some great footage. Obviously that takes a bit of tweaking, some extra work, but kind of just out of body, straight shooting, letting the camera decide what to happen, I will give the slight bump over onto the iPhone. Once again, super subjective. I think these are two of the best right now in the market that you can get. And I think the key difference on your decision, it's that classic debate. Are you team Apple? Have you been sucked into, not I would say the Apple black hole, but the ecosystem? Do you have a MacBook? Do you have an Apple Watch? Do you want iMessage to get into your group chats? Do you love AirDrop? If yes is to any of those things, the iPhone works well with everything else. If you're team Android, if you've got Windows, if you've got other Samsung devices, if you've got the new Tab S9 Ultra, which I think it's the best tablet out right now, or the new Galaxy Watch, obviously the S23 Ultra makes a ton more sense. So let me know down below in the comments which device you would take. If you're looking at color-wise, I think these are two of the best. Obviously the natural titanium, the cream, it's simple, but it's just super, super clean. Of course, if you're interested, I will leave links down below, and let the fanboys defend which phones they like. I'll catch the rest of you in one of my next episodes. Peace.